Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I am Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
And we post every week on a Friday, so do hit subscribe and notification bell if you want to know exactly what we're doing every week.
And don't forget too that we have our Monday Shorts where we answer somebody's question. So if you've got a question, put it in the comments below and we will hopefully get round to answering your question on our Monday Shorts.
We will indeed. I'm seeing a beautiful bed of orange tangerine behind us, Stephen.
Yes, one of
and
the...
a dogwood. Which are we talking about?
Well, we're not really necessarily talking about either in one sense, but they are part of the garden that we're in, which is a magnificent, one of the many magnificent gardens of Mount Macedon called Marnanie. And what we're looking at behind us is Alstroemeria, which is one of the thugs of the mountain. The Alstroemeria...
It's a pretty thug.
It is a pretty thug. It makes a great cut flower, but if you get it in one of your garden beds in our climate, you will never see the end of it. It's just horrendous.
We have witnessed that a few times. And a lovely dogwood.
Yes, a beautiful Cornus cusa up behind us, one of the Asian dogwoods, still in full bloom here and looking stunning.
But...
Yes, but... It's neither of those things that we've come to Marnanie for. We've come to this garden, which is one of the few places in Australia, albeit there's one or two I know of in the Dandenongs as well, but very, very few places have the wondrous and wonderful Himalayan lily growing en masse. So we're here to have a look at the Himalayan lilies, which are in flower, and to talk about them.
I am very excited because I have got one in a pot. It's in year 3, but we'll get to that later on.
Yeah.
We were just walking up the drive and both of us said, I think I can smell the lilies before we even saw them.
Yeah, the perfume is wafting through the garden. And I have to say there's not drifts of it, so it's not like it's making an overpowering presence visually, but there are a number of them in bloom, and yes, we could smell them from quite a distance.
Well, let's go and learn all about the Himalayan giant lily.
Yes.
Can't wait. Let's walk and talk.
All right, let's go.
Now, Stephen, when was this garden planted, do you think?
All right, well, the garden dates right back into the mid-19th century.
Yeah.
So it originally, funnily enough, was a cherry orchard way back, and this was part of the original cherry orchard.
That's very Chekhovian.
Yes, it was. So a lot of the planting would date back to those eras after about mid-1800s, and it was bought by... the most famous resident, I guess, was Sir Isaac, who was
a Governor-General.
He was our first Australian-born Governor-General, and he also was one of the people that put together our Australian Constitution. So that we've been having arguments about lately. So he was a very famous person. He lived up here with his family, and the property's actually named after his 2 daughters, Margaret and Nancy, so Marnanie. So that's where the name comes from.
And it looks fairly classic to me. I'm intrigued by the lilies, though. So when do you think they were planted? Was that part of the original planting?
No. Cardiocrinum probably wasn't around or even perhaps discovered back in the mid-1800s. The lilies were planted by another comparatively famous owner of this property, Kevin O'Neill, who was a well-known florist. Yes. And he was passionate about Cardiocrinum, and he got hold of some bulbs from one of the growers in the Dandenongs that had it in reasonable quantity and started the plants in the garden here. So that would be back in the late 1970s-ish. And so, so he was the one that sort of got them established here, and they've been here ever since.
So when did they become, well, I guess not widely available, but planted in Australia?
Well, they've been around for some time. There was a garden in the Dandenongs where they'd naturalised, and it became quite famous at one stage. And in fact, there was a push by the Lilium Society to have the property purchased at some stage to protect the Cardiocrinums. That never eventuated as far as I know. So we're talking about the time when Kevin O'Neill got his plants. I would say you would predate the actual introduction of Cardiocrinums to Australia by about 3 or 4 decades.
Right.
So they would have come in probably in the 30s or 40s.
Okay.
Yes, and have still only got a tenuous hold in this country.
And here we are. They are enormous. Okay.
All right.
Without further ado, I'm going to spin the camera around.
We're going to do a reveal.
They are enormous.
Yes, aren't they ever?
This is a very big plant, Stephen, and it's so tall that we can't be in the shop with it.
No, we can't. It's probably in excess of 3 metres. That's a lily on steroids for sure.
So that's about 10 feet, do you think?
Yeah, and they can get even slightly taller. I've seen bigger ones in some gardens.
It's the most extraordinary thing. So Tell me everything. Firstly, as you pointed out to me before, it's not a lily.
No, it's not lilium.
So what's its full name?
It's Cardiocrinum giganteum.
Cardio, as in
Heart,
pitter-pat, pitter-pat.
regards to its leaves. So it has a heart-shaped leaf, more or less.
How charming.
Yeah, so that's where the cardiocrinum comes from. So lily is cardio, or is crinum, and cardio is heart. So cardiocrinum, so
Heart lily.
heart lily, yes. Giganteum, of course, is somewhat self-explanatory.
Big, size matters.
Yeah. And it's a weird small genus from basically the Himalayas. So it grows through northern India and the Himalayas right through into China. There's 3 accepted species, Giganteum, and the other 2 are slightly smaller. There's Cathaiensis and there's Caudatum. So there's 3 species. They all have the family resemblance, large white flowers, trumpet-shaped, perfumed, but the other 2 species are much shorter, and there's also, I think, 1 accepted subspecies, and I'm not quite sure how it varies. So it's a very small genus of very few species of very spectacular plants.
They are. So what is the difference between this and, I noticed that sort of the regular liliums of horticulture, the hybrid ones, are in flower in your garden.
Yeah.
So we might just drop in a little bit to compare and contrast. So what is the difference between this lily, which is not a lily, and lilies, which are lilies?
Yeah, or lilium.
Or
If
lilium.
if we're going to be really specific, we should
Yes.
state lilium.
Because
Now,
the flowers, to my untrained eye, look identical.
they are very similar to most liliums, but there are a number of variations in this particular genus.
Yeah.
The first obvious one is the leaf shape, because all true liliums have comparatively narrow leaves.
Feathery,
Yeah, whereas Cardiocrinum has a big broad leaf in all its species. So that's the first obvious difference. The other differences, which are perhaps a little less obvious, the bulb is quite large and composed of very few scales, whereas with true liliums, they're often composed of many scales. The bulb also sits virtually at ground level, whereas liliums tend to pull themselves down. So you'll be able to, we'll get some close-ups of the
yes.
bulbs. They sit with their necks out of the ground, which
Like belladonnas.
yeah,
or
that sort of
hippeastras.
thing,
Yeah.
but I think for other reasons, because those bulbs come from quite hot, dry places and they need a baking. This obviously doesn't. The other thing about the plant is that the flowering stem, which takes many years to get to that point, once that bulb flowers, that bulb dies. So it is actually monocarpic.
Monocarpic, I was going to
Yeah.
say, and we have made a video about monocarpic plants.
Yeah. So the only good thing about this plant is that it produces offsets from the original bulb. So when the original bulb dies, you've normally got offsets, but they can take several years to settle down and flower as well. So you need to have bulbs at almost every stage if you're going to have flowers every year.
Well, we're lucky because you've spotted there is bulbs, plants at various stages of their
Yep,
life.
yep.
So we'll do a little bit about the life cycle.
And I guess the other thing we should mention, and I haven't seen one around, but we might find one, when they go to seed, they get very large seed pods, and they have sort of teeth around the edges of the splitting seed pod, and the seeds are all packed in it like books on a shelf. They're really tightly packed, and there's far more seeds in a Cardiocrinum seed pod than you'll get in the average Lilium seed pod. So, and then you just wait
smell.
10 years. Yes, you can pick it up. It's just amazing.
Oh, but it's quite high, so it's interesting because it's actually
It's
you do have-
wafting.
and you need, if you're above it. We were on the drive over there, and you can certainly, it's wafting up.
Well, scents do tend to go up on the air currents, so
Yeah.
yes, it's more obvious the perfume if we were standing above it.
But let's talk about the lifespan and the time when
Yeah.
we're looking at the other plants, because I'm intrigued, because I have one in a pot, and when we get to that, I need to ask you if it's a fool's paradise or whether it can actually go anywhere. But
Right.
the other thing is, that trunk is massive.
Yeah, and in fact, it's the only bulb that has made a musical instrument.
Well, there's a record you want to have.
Yeah.
What's the instrument? A pipe?
It's a sort of a fluty thing they do in Tibet out of the dried stems of Cardiocrinum.
Wow.
So there you go. There's another piece of complete and utter trivia that makes me interested in plants when I learn all these odd things about them. So yes, the only bulbous musical instrument.
Now, the other thing I'm noticing too, when the flowers, the new flowers are emerging, they're vertical, and then as they mature, they hang down.
Yeah, which is probably to do with protecting pollen from rain and other things and allowing a dry spot for the pollinator.
Right.
And interestingly, when they finish flowering and drop their flowers or their petals, the seed pods then curl up again and sit up like sort of a candelabry effect.
So maybe to encourage things to eat them and
Well,
distribute them.
I don't think so. No, it's
the
more
wind.
about wind. So I think once the seed pod's open, because they've got a white or a parchment-coloured papery edge around each seed, once they get loose, the wind will pick each one up individually and blow them out of the seed pod
Wow.
and hopefully to their new home.
Including mine.
Yes.
But let's get to that. All right, let's go and talk more about where and how to grow them, because there's one that's a bit lower down and we can actually be in the shop with the flower.
What a nice idea.
All right, Stephen. Oh! We're going to stand on a bench to get this. Look at the flowers. Can I smell it?
Yes, there you go.
It's not that strong when you're in it, but the
Yeah, it
collective-
obviously is one of those wafty perfumes, so which is great, I think, in a garden.
All right. Now, what we're going to talk about now is just the life cycle, because you alluded to the fact it's
Yeah.
a lengthy process. So
Yes.
I can also already see that these leaves are not looking healthy. So talk me through what happens
All right.
with this plant.
Let's start from seed. It's probably
beginning.
The beginning,
Now,
yes.
we talked about those little seeds being
Blown
blown
around.
away.
Now, the seed itself rarely germinates the first spring because the seed ripens in the autumn. You would collect it in the autumn, you would sow it in the autumn, and then you would assume, like most plants, come spring when the weather warms up, that the Cardiocrinum seedlings would start coming up.
But no.
No, they normally wait for the second spring. So there seems to be this inbuilt thing within the seed of long-term sort of dormancy. So the seed normally doesn't germinate in the first spring. So you've already taken 18 months to get them to germinate, right?
Now, you told a story when we made the film about, what's the handkerchief tree called?
Oh, the Davidia, yes.
Davidia, that when it was first brought into European culture and people tried to grow it, in the first year the seeds didn't germinate, they threw everything in the compost heap, and in year 2 the compost heap was full
Erupted,
of seedlings.
yes.
Similar story.
So similar story.
And actually from a similar part of the world.
Yes. So there must be something about the climate that promotes that double dormancy
They
thing
want to
going.
skip a year. Maybe,
Yeah.
oh, who knows, anyway.
Yeah. Anyhow, so your seedlings will start to germinate. So
Yeah.
the first year you'll get just a fine little sort of grassy looking thing come up from the seeds. And then the process starts. So you probably wait till the following season to then separate the bulbs individually away from the stock pot that you've raised them in.
Yeah.
And you grow them on. Now, the seedlings will take anywhere between 8 to 10 years from germination to actually flowering size. But in the meantime, those bulbs that you've got that are getting bigger and bigger year by year
Yeah.
will also be starting to produce offsets.
Right.
So what then happens is that once your plant actually flowers, the original bulb you raised from seed flowers,
Yeah, I'm just looking at the ones that are feet to see.
yes, they will have already started to produce some offsets. Now those offsets won't be big enough to flower the next year. They will also then need to build up enough strength to flower because you can imagine the amount of energy that goes into producing a 3 metre tall flower spike is quite an amount.
And this is a shorty.
Yeah, well, that's right. We're standing next to a little one here. So the offsets will then take several years to start flowering. So what you need to do, you'll find that the offsets at the base will be various sizes. So some of them, because they'll be slightly bigger than others, will flower younger than others. So you will, in fact, almost without trying, end up with a different amount of plants at different levels of flowering periods. So by having the different sized offsets. So that's how it would sort of work. And of course, if you're lucky enough for them to self-seed, then the seedlings will also do that. But be warned, seedlings are loved by slugs and snails.
Uh-huh.
So you have to be aware of them. That's one of their worst enemies apart from the wrong climate. So they love them.
Well, there's many things to talk about, but what I am observing here, and we'll talk more fully about habitat and
Yeah.
environment, but what I can see is a lot of small plants. So clearly, from like a numbers game, enough in this environment, which is semi-wild,
Yeah.
where there'd be lots of slugs and snails, enough have got through that first year.
Yeah, once they get through that first year or two, they might get a bit nipped by slugs and snails, but they normally are big enough and gutsy enough that they're more than a meal for a snail. So they hopefully then can do their own thing from
Yeah.
that point on.
Yeah.
So I guess the lesson that one needs to take away from growing
Yes, Stephen.
Cardiocrinums is
Patience.
do it when you're really young.
Well, Am I really young? So I've got one in a pot. This is the time for me to talk to you about pot culture of
Yeah,
these
all
lilies.
right.
Now, as I've bored all of our viewers with this information before, I'm in a rental while we're renovating.
Yes.
However, next year is the year where we are going to move in, well, 2024. Now, I bought one at a plant fair.
Yeah.
In fact, it could have been the one that you were talking at, the Yarra Valley Rare Plant Fair.
It could have been.
And I don't know how old the bulb was. Now, this year I've noticed, obviously it dies down in winter and it's gone gangbusters this year.
Yeah, we've had
But-
lots of spring rain, so it's
Yeah.
probably enjoyed that.
Not dissimilar, and I'll show you the size over here of what mine's looking like.
Yeah.
So firstly, I don't know how old it is, so it could take 5 to 6 to 8 years to bloom.
Anything is possible. Yeah.
However, can you grow them in pots? That's the million-dollar question.
Well, I don't know anybody who's actually grown them to flower in pots.
maybe I'll be the first.
Well, you could well be. Keeping in mind, because they're such a big, bulky plant, they're going to need a comparatively large container in due course.
Yeah.
And they're going to need a very humus-rich compost in which to grow, because in
Yep.
their natural habitat, they grow in very acidic, very humus-rich, leaf mouldy soil in the foothills of the Himalayas. So you've got to duplicate that to a large extent. And there was a very famous English lady gardener, and I can't remember whether it was Gertrude Jekyll or...
Vita Sackville West.
No, it wasn't Vita Sackville West. It was one of the older ones who had a huge patch of Cardiocrinums flowering superbly in her garden. And somebody came in and said to her, "How lucky are you?" And she said, "Luck has nothing to do with it."
Mae West said that as
yeah,
well.
Yeah, well, exactly. So she apparently had excavated a huge area, filled it full of humus-rich soil. So her gardeners had spent probably weeks preparing a bed for Cardiocrinums to grow in. And so she was determined to grow them well, and she put all her time, energy and effort into growing them, and was probably quite incensed when people said how lucky she was. And I understand why.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it is one of those plants that you can become obsessed by.
Well, let's watch this space, because if mine ever blooms in a pot, we will certainly fly the flags and make a little mini video
Yeah,
about
we
it.
will, yes.
Now, just back to this one. So these flowers look a little bit more advanced than that one, which
Yeah.
still has unopened buds.
Yeah.
So is the change in colour of leaf an indication that these are about to sort of turn into seed pods and it's now in its downward spiral, so the leaves are dying off, or has it got too much sun?
It's got too much sun. So the environment has changed.
Well look, let's not go into too much detail about environment here on this precarious bench. Let's go and talk about ideal habitat and this acidic flower bed
Yes.
over there by that one that's at waist height.
Good.
You going to jump? Oh, Stephen, this is just so bucolic and beautiful. I hope everyone can hear the trilling water, the birds.
Yes. The beautiful gurgling stream.
Nature, 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 which brings us cunningly to the notion of where does this grow and what are the perfect conditions for it?
All right.
It seems pretty happy here.
It is, because it's covering most of the things it requires.
Yeah.
It's got the deep, humus-rich acid soils.
Yes.
Ta-da, there. It has a sheltered aspect.
Can I just ask you, acid-rich soils, now, are soils naturally acidic because of leaf mold? So
Yeah.
are sort of deciduous woody forest soils naturally acidic?
Usually.
Right.
It's not always the case. I
Yeah.
mean, you can go into beech forests in Europe, and beech is often an indicator of alkaline soils.
Right.
So you can't always be assured. But in general, when you get into the lower reaches of a mountain range somewhere, as long as the mountain itself isn't a chalk hill or something like that,
Yeah.
most of them will in fact have acidic soil.
And so most of the woodland perennials are going to need an acidic soil. Right,
Yep.
okay.
So yes, and by nature things like pine needles and leafy material in general do tend to be acidic as they rot down.
Right.
So you end up with that really nice, rich, dark brown, delicious looking soil. So that's the first thing you need. Giant lilies grow quite tall, so they need shelter. So you don't want to try and grow them in a spot where they cop the winds.
Interesting. So we are in a very beautiful valley.
Exactly.
Ta-da.
So we've got wee stream at the bottom.
Yes.
We've got all of the right things around, big trees all around us. So the wind would rarely, if ever, get down into this particular spot where
Great.
the lilies are growing.
Never thought of that. There
There
you
you
go.
go. So yes, so they do need that. Just imagine if you've waited 10 years to see a flower and the flower spike just gets up really nice.
And whoosh.
And then, yes, you get the wind comes in and the whole thing falls apart. So that's one of the downsides of horticulture sometimes. So shelter from the winds. And apart from that, really, a spot where they get plenty of light but not too much direct sunlight. So they tend to get filtered light through the trees.
Now, your point with the other one we were looking at, which is sunburnt.
Yeah.
Now, just explain to the viewers why that is now getting more sun.
Yes. Well, we had a rather nasty storm on Mount Macedon sometime in the last 6 months or so. It came in like a tornado. And lots of gardens that have been sitting peacefully for the last 150 years suddenly had huge trees collapse all over the place. And this one had some enormous white poplars, Populus alba, come crashing down through the garden. And so it has opened the garden up substantially more than it was.
Which is a positive from a negative.
Yeah, and look, it still gets plenty of shade. The Cardiocrinums might get the odd burnt leaf, but they're not exposed to hot afternoon sun.
But your point is, because where we are now, we can see quite a lot of, not mature, but seedlings having a go.
Yeah.
So maybe the more light, because there's also a big storm 2 years ago, which also ripped through
Yeah,
Mount
yes.
Macedon. So do you think maybe generally more light in this valley has encouraged more growth over the last few
I'm
years?
convinced of that. I think that the Cardiocrinums will actually benefit from that little bit extra light. But I still have to stress though, they're not going to get that really hot afternoon sun.
And actually, I'll film this because these are in dappled light, which to me seems perfect for them.
Yes, they're doing rather well in there.
Yeah.
They're in amongst the canopy of large tree ferns.
Yeah.
They're quite close to the water, so there'd be capillary action of moisture coming up from the stream, and I mean they're in heaven.
So specifically then, we're looking at the foothills of the Himalaya. So temperatures, summer heat, winter cold,
Yeah,
where
well-
do they sit?
Well, they don't get a lot of summer heat. They're high enough up where the altitude would preclude you getting, 30-degree days and higher.
So back to me in my pot.
Yeah, you'll have to be careful with your potted
in
plant.
Melbourne summers.
Yes, exactly. So they're not going to get that much heat. Conversely, because they're in the foothills, they might get snow, but frost tends to radiate down to valleys, so they probably wouldn't get a lot of frost. And in fact, in areas where you do get heavy frost, it probably would pay to put some leaf litter or some straw over the dormant bulbs in the winter, because they sit at ground level, so they could easily get bitten by the frost. So in areas where you get heavy frost, I would definitely suggest a mulch over them during the winter months.
So basically cooler temperate climates, which
Yeah.
is not Melbourne.
No, but it is up
Oh,
here
well.
at Mount Macedon.
It is, lucky you.
Yeah.
Watch this space, viewers, if I can possibly raise mine. It survived 2 years though. It survived last summer.
Our YouTube channel may have to go on for many years before we can feature your Cardiocrinum
I'm
in
up
bloom,
for it.
though.
Are you?
Oh, I hope so.
All right, so we've covered, I guess, moisture. Obviously, we're in the foothills of the Himalaya. Probably more like a cloud forest too, though. Lots of airborne.
they'd get lots of mist.
Yeah.
They'd be in summer monsoonal areas mainly, so they'd get summer rain when they're actively growing.
True.
They could be under a layer of snow in the winter, so that would keep them actually, funnily enough, slightly dryish. So they're the sorts of things that you need to know about a Cardiocrinum that you don't necessarily have to completely duplicate. I mean, we can't necessarily put a snow cover over things, but you have to keep them in mind, and you have to adapt your plant so that it's got as close to its natural habitat as possible.
Well, here they are in this little valley in Mount Macedon, and they have naturalized beautifully. They're obviously producing viable seed. It's obviously over the years been germinating, growing. Looks like there are plants at different life cycles, but I think you found a particularly small one.
Yeah, I found a little baby seedling that I think is probably a couple of years old.
So maybe let's go and look at that and a few other sort of juvenile ones and get a sense of where they might be at.
Yeah, all right. Well, I've had a good look around and I can't find any first year seedlings. That might just be that they didn't flower last year, or I'm just not observant enough. But I have found a wee seedling here, which I would say is probably a second year plant. So you can see it's got by now the classical shape of the Cardiocrinum leaf, but only one leaf with the seedling. So it'll take 2 to 3 years more now for it to build up to have multiple leaves. All right, well, I'm standing amongst a drift of younger plants of the Cardiocrinum, and it's a bit of a guesstimate, but I'd say most of these are in their 4th, 5th or 6th year from seed. And you can see each individual has got several leaves. This one here is even bigger, so that one's going to flower sooner than perhaps this one. And then you've got one down here that's even smaller again. Now, they could still be seedlings from the same batch of seed, but they haven't taken off as fast as others. So in a sense, it's as much about growing them well to build them up to flowering size as the amount of time that's involved. So you can end up with sister seedlings from the same seed pod that don't grow as fast as others. So you'll almost invariably end up with that different sort of age difference in a way, even though they're all the same age. I don't quite know how to explain it any better, but there you go. And of course, as long as you've got bulbs of different sizes, that will mean that you'll then end up with having flowering sized plants in different years. So it does give you that sort of continuity of blooming, because if you've just flowered one and that's it, then it's years to wait for the next batch. It suddenly struck me, wandering around this garden and looking at the Cardiocrinums, just how closely the leaves of a hosta and a Cardiocrinum match. So you probably wouldn't use them as a contrasting plant, but I'm wondering whether a good colony of hostas in the garden might sidetrack the slugs and snails long enough for your Cardiocrinum to get through the ravages.
All right, Stephen, we are in your garden. Now, this is the lilium that
Yes.
most people will be familiar with.
Well, at least one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, they're incredibly important garden plants for summer flowering, and there is just so many different forms, hybrids and species in true liliums
Yeah.
that there's almost one for everybody.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the upright flowered oriental style lilies. I don't remember its name. It was something or another red, and it is pretty spectacular.
But it is in full sun
Full sun,
and it flowers once a year,
yes.
and it has a very different bulb, you were saying, to the giant Himalayan lily we were looking at.
It does. It has a bulb with lots more scales on it. And of course, the bulbs are deeper in the ground. And true liliums will often get roots on the stem above the bulb as well, which of course Cardiocrinums can't do because their bulbs sit above the ground.
Now, the other thing is, will a lilium bulb multiply flower from that same bulb? Or does
Yes.
it...
Yeah,
Does
no,
it-
it's one of the main differentiation points. So if you've got a good lilium growing in your garden, it will multiply, so you'll get small bulbs that will form around it, just like the Cardiocrinum does, but the original bulb will flower for many, many years. So
Right.
it can just keep flowering, and sometimes it can get bigger and bigger, and the stems will get taller and taller, and the flowers will get bigger, but they'll never get as big as a Cardiocrinum.
No. Now, what about seed setting? So do these hybrids set seed? Does it go through the same cycle of maturity that the other ones we were just looking at, Cardiocrinum?
They will, although these particular types of liliums generally will flower much, much quicker from seed than a Cardiocrinum. They don't need the double dormancy. They normally come up the following spring after you've sown them.
Yeah.
And it might only be 2 or 3 years away before you start getting flowers on any that you raise from seed. But remember, if you've got a good lily in the garden at home and you raise seed from it, there's absolutely no guarantee that the babies are going to be even vaguely like the parent, because
Yes.
there's been so much crossing over the years.
Yeah.
You could end up with almost anything.
Well, there you go. Well, we've seen these. Let's head back to the giant Himalayan lily.
Please.
Stephen Ryan, I
Yes.
have loved our visit to the giant Himalayan lilies at Marnanie.
Yes. I don't know how I can top this, in fact.
Well, you can't, you're too short.
Yeah, well, exactly. It has been great. They're a great group of plants, and it's not often that people get a chance to engage with them.
Well,
So
I've
there you
never
go.
seen them in bloom. I've only ever seen them in pictures. So this is extraordinary. So a million thanks to the very kind, generous owners of Marnanie, which is a private house.
Yes, it is indeed a private house, and the husband, Geordie, runs a fabulous nursery down in Riddles Creek, which is a town only 10 minutes away from the garden.
And we'll put the link below. And Charlotte runs amazing events here at Marnanie, and I'll put the link below as well. And if you're in Australia or Victoria, you should definitely look at her Instagram account to see when she's next doing amazing events in the house. So you can get a chance to come and look at the garden and the house on your own terms.
And maybe you'll be lucky enough to be here at the right time of the year to see some Cardiocrinums in
Yes,
flower.
it's early summer here in Australia, so that's the time when they're doing their thing in Mount Macedon.
Fantastic.
Now, if you want to know what we are doing next week, which won't be as tall or perhaps as fragrant, you'll have to hit subscribe.
Yes, and join us. And don't forget that if you would like to ask me a question, we cover those in our 60-second Monday shorts. So put your question in the comments section below. Make sure you tell me where you're from so that I've got proper context, and I will try and answer your questions.
And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Exactly. Bye all.